Screams echoed through the canyon like the cries of ghosts, each one sharper and more desperate than the last. Lila's wrists burned where the ropes bit into her skin, her arms straining against the bindings as the bandits dragged her toward the cabin. The men reeked of whiskey and sweat, their eyes dark and gleaming like wolves circling a wounded deer. "Pretty thing, ain't she?" the leader sneered, yanking Lila's hair back so hard her neck snapped backward. "Reckon she'll fetch a good price, or maybe we keep her for ourselves." The other men laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like the devil's own chorus. Lila bit her lip, forcing herself not to cry. Crying would only make them hungrier. The cabin door swung open with a creak, and the stench of stale beer and rot filled her nose. Inside, the floor was littered with broken bottles, cards stained with whiskey, and bones gnawed clean. They shoved her to the ground, her knees slamming against the dirt floor as the leader crouched in front of her, his face so close she could count the yellowed, broken teeth. "What's your name, darlin'?" he cooed, stroking a filthy finger down her cheek. Lila's jaw clenched, the taste of blood and dirt thick on her tongue. "Go to hell." The leader's eyes flashed, and his fist shot out, striking her across the face. Lila's head snapped to the side, pain exploding across her cheek as stars danced in her vision. "Feisty one," he muttered, standing and wiping his hand on his coat. "Tie her up. We'll deal with her later." The men dragged her toward the corner, tossing her onto a filthy pile of blankets that smelled of sweat and fear. Outside, the sun dipped lower behind the canyon walls, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. And in those shadows, just beyond the edge of the bandits' camp, a pair of dark eyes watched. A Lakota warrior crouched in the underbrush, his jaw tight, his fists clenched, his eyes fixed on the woman inside the cabin, the woman who had once been his. The fire crackled in the center of the camp, sending sparks spiraling up into the night like dying stars. Lila's wrists ached from the ropes, her skin raw and bleeding, her eyes swollen from the slap. The bandits laughed and drank, their voices booming across the canyon, drowning out the sound of her ragged breaths. But outside the circle of firelight, in the darkness where the flames couldn't reach, Ahanu crouched low, his eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He watched the men through the underbrush, his hand wrapped around the hilt of his knife, his heart pounding like a war drum. They had taken her. Lila, the woman he'd once sworn to protect, the woman he'd once loved before everything fell apart, before she was stolen from him. Inside the cabin, the leader of the bandits leaned over Lila, his shadow falling over her like a black cloud. "You know, darlin'," he said, his breath hot and sour against her face. "You don't have to make this hard on yourself. Be sweet to me, and maybe I won't sell you off to the highest bidder." Lila turned her face away, her stomach churning as he trailed a grimy finger down her neck. "You lay another finger on me," she said, her voice low and hard, "and you'll be the one begging." The leader threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing through the camp. "You hear that, boys? This one thinks she's got some fight in her." The men laughed, hooting and jeering, and in the darkness, Ahanu's grip tightened around the knife. He could hear her voice, shaking but strong, and it burned through him like fire. He had to get her out. He had to get her out now. But there were 5 of them, 5 men with guns and knives and nothing to lose. Ahanu's jaw clenched as he ran his thumb over the blade, his heart pounding like a war drum. He had no plan, no backup, no chance of walking away alive. But that didn't matter, because Lila was in there, and even if it cost him his life, he wasn't leaving without her. Not this time. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of blood and whiskey, the echoes of the bandits' laughter cutting through the night like a blade. Inside the cabin, Lila's wrists bled against the ropes, her eyes fixed on the door, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Outside, Ahanu crouched low, his body pressed against the side of the cabin, his knife clenched so tight his knuckles burned white. The firelight flickered through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting shadows that danced like specters across the dirt. He could hear them, the men inside, their voices slurred and loud, boasting about what they would do to Lila when they were done drinking. "She thinks she's tough," the leader sneered, his voice a venomous slur. "But she'll break. They all do." Another man laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Let me have a go at her first." Ahanu's jaw clenched, his breath hot against the cold night air. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't risk them touching her. Not again. He crept around the back of the cabin, his eyes scanning the shadows, his ears straining for the slightest sound. The first man was stationed by the back door, a rifle slung lazily across his lap, his eyes half-lidded as he took another swig from a whiskey bottle. He never saw Ahanu coming. The knife flashed in the firelight, slicing clean through the air. The man's eyes bulged, his mouth opening in a silent scream as Ahanu clamped a hand over his mouth, the blade driving deep into his side. Blood poured down Ahanu's hand, warm and sticky, as the man's body went limp. Ahanu dragged him into the shadows, lowering him silently to the ground. Inside, the men continued to laugh, oblivious to the fact that their numbers were already dwindling. Ahanu wiped the blood from his knife, his jaw clenched, his dark eyes fixed on the door. 1 down, 4 to go. And inside, Lila sat alone in the dark, her heart pounding against her ribs, her mind flashing back to the last time she saw Ahanu, when he had promised to come back for her. And now, somewhere in the night, he was keeping that promise, one dead man at a time. Lila's breaths came in short, panicked gasps as the men's voices grew louder, their laughter echoing through the cabin like a pack of wolves circling prey. The leader leaned against the wall, his eyes dark and predatory, as he tipped his whiskey bottle back and took a long, slow swig. "You know," he slurred, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, "you keep looking at that door like some white knight's gonna come barging in to save you." Lila swallowed, her throat raw, her hands trembling against the ropes. "I don't need saving," she said, her voice breaking. "Not from the likes of you." The leader chuckled, the sound as sharp and hollow as a gunshot. "Oh, you will," he said, pushing off the wall and stalking toward her. "You will." But outside, in the shadows, Ahanu moved like a ghost, his bare feet silent against the dirt, his knife gleaming like a wolf's fang in the firelight. He counted the men, 3 now, sitting around the fire, their guns tossed carelessly to the side. The leader was inside, with Lila. One wrong move and she was dead. But Ahanu had made a promise. To Lila, to himself, to the man he used to be before the world ripped them apart. And he intended to keep it. The first man sat with his back to the cabin door, laughing as he tossed a handful of bones onto the dirt, the dice rattling like death. He never saw Ahanu coming. The knife slid between his ribs, quick and clean, and Ahanu caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him silently into the dirt. 2 left. The second man's eyes went wide, his jaw dropping as he saw his friend's body slump to the ground. "What the hell?" Ahanu was on him in 2 strides, the knife flashing in the firelight, the blade slicing clean across the man's throat. Blood sprayed across the dirt, and the man fell, gurgling, his eyes rolling back as the life bled out of him. 1 left. Inside the cabin, Lila's eyes darted to the door, her heart slamming against her ribs as the leader grabbed her by the hair, dragging her up to her feet. "You're mine now," he hissed, his breath hot against her ear, "and no one's coming to save you." But outside, Ahanu's dark eyes burned like embers as he pushed open the door, the blood-soaked knife gleaming in his hand. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low and lethal. "I'm here." The door slammed against the wall with a deafening crash, and for a heartbeat, the entire world went still. The leader's grip on Lila's hair tightened, his filthy fingers digging into her scalp as he yanked her backward, holding her like a human shield. Ahanu stood framed in the doorway, his chest heaving, his dark eyes blazing with fury as he took in the scene, Lila's tear-streaked face, the leader's cruel, snarling grin, the blood still dripping from Ahanu's knife. "Well, well," the leader drawled, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "You must be the redskin I keep hearing about. Come to play hero, have you?" Ahanu's jaw clenched, his fists tightening around the hilt of the knife. "Let her go," he said, his voice low and deadly. "Or what?" the leader sneered, dragging Lila closer, his arm wrapping around her throat. "You gonna kill me? Go on. Try it. But you'll have to go through her first." Lila whimpered, her eyes meeting Ahanu's, and in that moment, 100 memories flashed between them. Stolen kisses in the moonlight, whispered promises beneath the stars, the night he had sworn to come back for her. "Ahanu," she whispered, her voice a broken sob. "Don't." The leader's grin widened, his eyes gleaming like a wolf's in the dark. "Hear that? She don't want you, boy. Ain't nobody ever wanted you." Ahanu's grip on the knife tightened, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. "You're wrong," he said, his voice a growl. "She did." And in one fluid motion, he lunged. The knife flashed through the air, the blade slicing clean through the leader's forearm. The man howled, his grip on Lila loosening just enough for her to twist away. She fell to the ground, gasping for breath as the leader staggered back, clutching his bleeding arm. Ahanu was on him in a heartbeat, his fist slamming into the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The leader hit the ground hard, dust billowing up around him as Ahanu dropped to his knees, the knife pressed against the man's throat. "You took her from me," Ahanu said, his voice a rasp. "You hurt her. You hurt what's mine." The leader's eyes widened, sweat pouring down his face as he gasped, "Please, don't!" Ahanu's jaw clenched, his breathing ragged, his muscles shaking with the effort to hold himself back. And behind him, Lila watched, her hands pressed to her mouth, her heart pounding as she whispered, "Ahanu, don't do it." But in Ahanu's eyes, she saw it, the man he used to be, the man he swore he would never become. And in that moment, she knew the war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The fire crackled outside, its glow flickering through the open doorway like ghostly fingers reaching for the living. Ahanu's knife hovered over the leader's throat, the blade glinting dangerously as blood trickled down the man's neck. The leader's eyes were wild, his breaths coming in ragged, panicked gasps as Ahanu pressed the blade harder against his skin. "You took her," Ahanu said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You hurt her, and now you want mercy?" The leader swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing against the blade. "Please," he rasped, his eyes darting to Lila, who lay slumped against the wall, her wrists raw and bleeding, her eyes dazed with shock. "It was just business. I swear business," Ahanu repeated, his jaw tight, his dark eyes narrowed. "Was it business when you dragged her from her home? Was it business when you put your filthy hands on her?" "I didn't," the leader started, but the words died in his throat as Ahanu leaned closer, his eyes blazing. "You stole her from me," Ahanu said, his breath hot against the man's face. "And now I'm taking back what's mine." The leader whimpered, his eyes squeezing shut as Ahanu raised the knife. But before the blade could descend, a sound echoed through the canyon, a gunshot. Ahanu's head snapped up, his eyes darting to the doorway. Outside, the two remaining bandits stood in the firelight, guns drawn, their faces grim and set. "Drop the knife," one of them barked, his pistol aimed squarely at Ahanu's chest. "Or we'll put you down like a dog." Ahanu's jaw clenched, his heart pounding as he glanced at Lila. She shook her head, her eyes wide and pleading, tears streaming down her face. "Ahanu, don't." The leader seized the distraction, his hand shooting out to grab Ahanu's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, and the two men crashed into the dirt, fists flying, bones cracking. The bandits rushed forward, guns blazing. Ahanu rolled to the side, the bullets whizzing past his head as he grabbed the knife, slashing upward. The leader screamed, blood spurting from his arm as Ahanu pushed him away, his body shaking, his breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "Ahanu!" Lila screamed as the two bandits closed in, their guns raised, their eyes dark with murder. And in that moment, Ahanu knew he wasn't getting out of this alive, not unless he did what he swore he would never do again. Not unless he killed. The air crackled with the scent of gunpowder, and the ground was stained red with blood. Ahanu's chest heaved as he scrambled to his feet, the knife clenched tight in his fist. The two bandits moved closer, their guns aimed at his heart, their eyes glinting with the promise of death. "Ain't no place for a savage here," one of them sneered, cocking the hammer back. "You should have stayed in the shadows where you belong." Ahanu's jaw clenched, his dark eyes burning as he spread his stance, his muscles taut and ready to strike. "You came into my shadow," he said, his voice a low, deadly rasp. The first bandit fired. Ahanu dropped to the ground, the bullet slicing past his ear with a shriek that echoed through the canyon. Dust exploded around him as he rolled to the side, springing back to his feet just as the second bandit aimed his gun. Time slowed. Ahanu could see it all. Lila, slumped against the wall, her face streaked with blood and tears. The leader, crawling through the dirt, one arm hanging uselessly at his side, eyes blazing with hatred. And the two men in front of him, guns raised, fingers tightening around the triggers. Ahanu lunged. The knife flashed through the air, catching the first bandit across the throat. Blood sprayed like rain, and the man staggered back, his eyes wide and disbelieving as his knees buckled and he crumpled to the ground. The second bandit roared, his gun firing wildly, but Ahanu was already moving, a blur of muscle and fury. He crashed into the man, the impact sending them both sprawling into the dirt. The gun skittered away, and they rolled, fists flying, teeth bared, the world reduced to a blur of fists and blood and fury. Ahanu's knuckles slammed against the man's jaw, the crack of bone echoing through the canyon. The bandit gasped, blood pouring from his nose as he tried to reach for the knife on his belt. But Ahanu was faster. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it until he heard the sickening snap of bone, and then drove his knee into the man's chest, pinning him to the ground. "You took her," Ahanu snarled, his breath hot and ragged. "You hurt her, and now you want mercy." The man choked, blood bubbling from his lips. "Please," he whispered, his eyes rolling back. "Please." Ahanu raised the knife, the blade gleaming in the firelight. But before he could strike, a voice echoed through the canyon. Lila's voice, sharp and desperate. "Ahanu!" she screamed, her eyes wild and terrified. "Behind you!" Ahanu spun around just as the leader charged at him, a broken whiskey bottle clutched in his hand like a makeshift blade. The man's face was twisted with fury, his eyes bloodshot, blood dripping from the wound Ahanu had given him earlier. "You think you can take what's mine?" the leader roared, swinging the bottle in a wild, desperate arc. Ahanu ducked, the glass whistling past his ear as he drove his fist into the man's ribs, feeling the crunch of bone beneath his knuckles. The leader grunted, but he didn't go down. Instead, he swung again, the bottle slashing through the air, catching Ahanu across the cheek. Pain exploded through Ahanu's skull, hot and blinding, as blood poured down his face. The world swam in and out of focus, and through the blur, he could see Lila still slumped against the wall, her eyes wide and terrified. The leader grinned, his teeth stained with blood as he raised the bottle again, his chest heaving, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "You should have stayed away, savage," he sneered. "Now I'm going to carve you up." But Ahanu wasn't done. Not yet. He surged forward, his body a blur of fury and pain, his fist slamming into the man's jaw with enough force to crack bone. The leader staggered back, the bottle slipping from his hand and shattering against the dirt floor. Ahanu grabbed him by the collar, slamming him into the wall, his face inches from the man's, his breath hot and ragged. "You hurt her," Ahanu growled, his voice a dangerous rasp. "You stole her from me, and now you're going to pay." The leader's eyes darted to the side, and that's when Ahanu saw it. The glint of steel, the flash of a knife as the last bandit lunged from the shadows, his blade aimed straight at Ahanu's back. Lila screamed, her voice slicing through the air like a whip. "Ahanu, behind you!" But Ahanu was already moving. He dropped the leader, spinning around just in time to catch the bandit's wrist, the knife inches from his throat. They struggled, the knife trembling between them, the bandit's teeth bared, his eyes wild with desperation. "You're dead!" the bandit snarled, pushing the blade closer, closer, until the tip bit into Ahanu's skin. "Not today," Ahanu said, his voice a growl, and with one last burst of strength, he twisted the man's arm, the knife turning in his hand until the blade was aimed at his own chest. The bandit's eyes widened, a gasp tearing from his throat as the knife sank deep into his flesh. Blood poured down his shirt, dark and thick, as his knees buckled and he collapsed at Ahanu's feet. The leader watched, his eyes wide, his body shaking as he crawled backward through the dirt. "Please," he whimpered, his voice quivering. "Please, don't." But Ahanu's dark eyes burned like coals as he stepped forward, his knife still dripping blood. And this time, he wasn't going to stop. Not until the man who took Lila from him paid the ultimate price. The fire crackled behind Ahanu, casting his shadow long and dark across the dirt floor. The leader scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the ground as he tried to pull himself away. Blood dripped from his lip, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. Ahanu stalked forward, his knife gleaming like a fang in the firelight, his jaw clenched, his eyes wild with fury. "Please!" the leader whimpered, his back hitting the cabin wall, his legs trembling as he tried to stand. "It was just business, I swear, just business." Ahanu's jaw tightened, his muscles coiled tight as a bowstring. "Business?" he spat, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "You stole her from me. You laid your filthy hands on her. You think that's just business?" The leader shook his head, his eyes wide and pleading, his chest heaving as Ahanu loomed over him like death itself. I didn't know she was yours," he stammered, his eyes darting toward Lila, who lay slumped against the wall, her wrists still bound, her eyes half-lidded and dazed. "I don't care what you knew," Ahanu said, his voice dark as a storm. "All I care about is what you did." He dropped to his knees, his face inches from the leader's, his dark eyes burning. "And what you're going to pay for?" The leader swallowed, his throat bobbing, his jaw trembling as Ahanu raised the knife. "No," he gasped, his voice breaking. "Please don't!" But Ahanu's fist shot out, slamming into the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The leader's head snapped back against the wall, blood spurting from his nose as he slumped to the ground, groaning. Did she beg? Ahanu said, his voice a deadly whisper. Did she beg you to stop? The leader's eyes rolled back, his lips moving in a silent, breathless prayer. Ahanu grabbed him by the collar, dragging him up to his knees, the knife pressed against his throat. Answer me! The leader sobbed, his shoulders shaking, his breath hitching as tears mixed with blood and sweat. Yes, he choked out, his voice raw. Yes, she begged, but I didn't listen. Ahanu's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding as the knife pressed deeper, a thin line of blood trickling down the man's neck. Well, now it's your turn, he said, his voice cold and empty. Beg. The leader's eyes bulged, his chest heaving, his mouth opening to speak. But before he could say another word, Lila's voice echoed through the room, soft and broken. Ahanu, stop. Ahanu froze, his breath catching, his grip on the knife tightening. He turned, his eyes meeting Lila's, and in that instant the rage melted away, leaving only the broken boy he once was. Please, Lila whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. Don't become him. And for the first time since he walked into that cabin, Ahanu's hand trembled. The fire crackled softly, its glow casting flickering shadows across the blood-soaked cabin floor. The leader lay slumped against the wall, his eyes half closed, his breaths shallow and ragged as blood seeped from the cut across his neck. Ahanu stood over him, his chest heaving, the knife still clenched in his shaking hand. Lila's voice echoed in his mind. Don't become him. The words hit him like a fist to the gut, shattering the rage that had consumed him. He dropped the knife. It clattered to the ground, the sound echoing through the silent room. Lila watched him from where she lay, slumped against the wall, her eyes wide and haunted, her wrists still bound, her cheek bruised and swollen. Ahanu's chest rose and fell, his breaths coming in shuddering gasps as he staggered back, his hands slick with blood. Lila, he whispered, his voice breaking. She flinched, her eyes darting to the knife lying between them. Are you okay? He asked, his voice thick with emotion, his jaw clenched as tears burned behind his eyes. Lila's gaze met his, and for a moment everything fell away. The blood, the bodies, the memories of the night she was taken from him. All that remained was the boy she once knew, the boy who had held her hand beneath the moonlight and promised to protect her. I thought you were dead, she said, her voice shaking, her eyes brimming with tears. They said you were dead. Ahanu swallowed hard, his throat tight as he knelt before her, his hands trembling as he untied the ropes around her wrists. I almost was, he said, his voice cracking. But I came back for you. I promised I would. Lila's wrists were raw and bleeding, the skin rubbed raw from the ropes. Ahanu took her hands in his touch gentle despite the blood still drying on his knuckles. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I should have found you sooner, You're here now, Lila said, her voice soft, her fingers curling around his. That's all that matters. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of blood and smoke. The leader groaned, his eyelids fluttering as he struggled to stay conscious. Ahanu's jaw clenched, his gaze darkening. We have to go, he said, his voice tight, his hands still wrapped around Lila's. He won't stop, not until he's dead. Lila nodded, her eyes hardening as she rose to her feet, leaning heavily against Ahanu. Then let's finish it. And as they stepped out into the night, the fire blazing behind them, Ahanu knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, or not at all.